Hello, welcome back to our series of informal chats with friends and colleagues from all over the Netherlands. Today, we have the pleasure to have with us two friends, two guests from Radboud University in Nijmegen, Albertine Bloemendal and Jorrit van den Berg, who both teach US history and US politics and government and foreign policy, foreign relations at Radboud. They are both NASA members, and recently Albertine has been appointed in the NASA steering committee. Congratulations for that, Albertine. And it's really a pleasure to have them with us today because they represent, in a way, the newest generation of Americanists in this country, in the Netherlands. So it will be nice to talk with them about their impressions of the future, the contemporary and future directions that the US is taking at the moment. But I wanted to start this conversation by asking both Albertine and Jorrit something more about what is at the moment their newest research project. I know they have a few things lined up, like a symposium I have submitted a paper for, and it's all about the role of gratitude in transatlantic relations, which is per se a fascinating topic. So I would like to ask you to explain how you want to pursue this research project. What do you mean about gratitude? But also, in the end, I wanted to ask you a very basic question, whether or not you think that gratitude really depends in the end on an asymmetrical relation or not, and whether or not that asymmetrical relation where somebody is superior than somebody else still counts in our contemporary transatlantic relations.
Well, thank you, Dario. Shall I start, Albertina?
Yeah, that's fine. Go ahead.
Okay, good. Well, thank you also for the introduction. I didn't realize that we were still part of the newest generation of Americans. I thought that by now we might be somewhere in the middle. Yeah, so we're
self-celebratory, sorry.
So yeah, Albertina and I and a colleague from the UK, Radboud Berk, we're setting up a symposium about transatlantic gratitude. The both of us mainly came to that topic, I think, by studying post-war transatlantic relations, and for me it was the Marshall Plan. And so we thought that this term of gratitude, that a lot of recent innovations and directions in the study of foreign relations can come together under gratitude. So, for example, effective communities, how those are built and maintained, public diplomacy, things like that. And we've received a number of proposals on, pretty much every Western European and country and the United States, which studies this question of gratitude from multiple perspectives. And yeah, as you suggested, I think gratitude can be at the center of an asymmetrical relationship, in the sense that there's someone providing the gratitude, someone receiving it. It suggests an asymmetrical power relationship. And we think, Albertina and I, we're working on gratitude for the Marshall Plan, that Dutch gratitude for the Marshall Plan was one way, developing a narrative about Dutch gratitude for the United States. It was one way for the Dutch to navigate a new post-World War II reality, in which the Dutch had become a small power and the United States had become the dominant power in the Atlantic region.
And I think if I can add to that, one of the very interesting things about that mediation of this asymmetrical relationship and the way in which gratitude plays a role in that is also very much close to memory and history and diplomatic narratives about the history of, for example, Dutch-American relations. And you do see that the Netherlands and, well, the Dutch, for example, also use this history to place this, the gratitude of the Marshall Plan so Dutch diplomats, Dutch citizens express gratitude for what the United States has done. For example, the role of the US in liberating Western Europe, and then, of course, the role in the Marshall Plan, etc., that we are focusing on specifically. But then also try to kind of mediate that in a way by using history, by putting it into a longer narrative of Dutch-American relations, right? In the sense of, okay, we're very grateful for what you did for us in this context. But let's not forget that when you were still a very young country, John Adams got a loan from the Netherlands and we helped you out, right? And by using history this way, it also helps kind of to demonstrate that over time it was a give and take, and it was not just the Netherlands depending on the United States, but that we also had something to offer to the US, even though the relationship has changed because the power relationship has changed, of course, as well. But it also offers so that those historical narratives in this context also help to kind of to make the Dutch to help them look a little less like just a receiving partner, right? So we're grateful for what the US did, but let's not forget when Mark Rutte visited the White House, his gift was a copy of the loan from John Adams. Just remember, we used to help you guys out as well, right? So that.
This is something I really find fascinating from your project, the political use of this instrument that you have been defining as narrative, as an historical narrative about gratitude. But there is, or at least there seems to me to be also another leg or another dimension of this process, that is the public use, or if you want, the bottom-up use of gratitude, right? Which in the Netherlands is also a very important component of the bilateral relationships between the two countries, right?
Yes, that's actually something that I try to focus on in a different research project that I'm not doing together with Jorrit, but that I'm working on myself at the moment. That has to do with the history of Margraat and the U.S. military cemetery, for example, and Dutch citizens who have taken the initiative themselves to express their gratitude to American soldiers that have given their lives to liberate the Netherlands, among and so by adopting the graves of these American soldiers at Margraat, the cemetery, which is really a grassroots initiative in the sense, really also is stronger in a way, I would argue, because the initiative comes from the people themselves and is not initiated by the government, is not instrumentalized at least there was no diplomatic motive behind it necessarily, although I do think that it has come to play an important role, or interesting role at the very least, in Dutch-American relations and diplomacy. But I think this is a very important dimension that you just pointed at.
Just I have a lot of other questions, but I also want to bring Case in. The only curiosity I have about this project is, do you think this is a very regional thing, specific and limited to Limburg, or is it possible to be applied nationwide?
And what?
I know Limburg is a very specific and peculiar region, if you want.
Yes.
Very well attached to the narrative of liberation and of gratitude.
Yeah.
Do you think this can be expanded to the rest of or other parts of the country, or more?
I think that the adoption program, for example, it logically started in the Margraat community, but that has expanded as well, right? And I think it has inspired other people also in Belgium, for example, to also adopt graves there and in other places. But I do think you're right that there is a very strong local component to that, because the area that you just described, and particularly the southern part of Limburg, was liberated by the Americans, of course. And American soldiers stayed there for a long time because it was liberated very early in the war. And a great part of the rest of the country was still occupied until May 1945, and all this time there were these Americans present there, which I think greatly impacted that local community, which we can still feel today, I think.
Well, some of them never left, right? They're still there.
Yeah, absolutely, that's true, of course. Yeah, there's still this presence. Yeah. So I think there is a very important local component to it. Absolutely. Yeah.
What is interesting to me is that you're in a sense describing one way to kind of think about this project, one way to think about how the Marshall Plan, the liberation is memorialized and historicized is as a way to kind of rewrite the history of the Netherlands after 1945 as a transatlantic, or at least as an Atlantic-facing nation, right? Rediscovering, in a sense, those kind of little nuggets of history that would have been footnotes in earlier ideas of what the Netherlands was as a country, right? The John Adams ambassadorship to The Hague, the first salute at St. Eustatius, the way that sort of these early kind of Dutch declarations of independence get sort of reappropriated during the American Revolution. You know, these are ways that are sort of consciously, in a sense, kind of rediscovered and kind of written into this shared history, which continues to be brought up. I mean, I think the American ambassador, Piet Hoekstra, is, I think, currently in the process of visiting the birthplaces or visiting the places where some of the American presidents with Dutch roots, including the Roosevelts, but also Martin van Buren, John Adams, have kind of Dutch ties to. I'm always wondering, to what extent do you think that this is kind of an instance of history being sort of put to political uses, right? To what extent is this idea that we have as the Netherlands as at least within the context of continental Europe, as a uniquely Atlantic-facing country, are we kind of congratulating ourselves on that? Or is that something, is this claim that we exercise on American history something that really just is intended to, in a sense, flatter the Dutch?
I think that is an interesting idea, Case. I also think, but this is based on what I've seen historically, that gratitude, it does imply a kind of mutuality, where the Dutch can say, well, we're grateful for, let's say, Marshall aid, as, you know, something that's sprung from American philanthropy. But don't think that this gives you the right to be overbearing or anything like that. So it also kind of puts a moral claim on the giver, I suppose. I'm not sure that is what you wanted to know, but that is in part how I see it.
Mm-hmm. It's not exactly my question.
No.
Which in a sense relates to how the Netherlands sees itself, its place in the world, how it still, in a sense, thinks of itself as having something of a special relationship with the United States, something that is shared in recent history, in the Marshall Plan, in the liberation, but also which has sort of deeper roots in the Netherlands' own transatlantic history. I've always wondered to what extent this is really something, you know, this is something that is internal to the Dutch. Is it in any sense kind of meaningfully recognized also on the other side of the Atlantic?
So what you're implying is that transatlantic gratitude is a component of Dutch exceptionalism.
In a sense, but I would argue that sort of this way that we have, that this way of thinking about Dutch history, right? A way that foregrounds the history of Dutch republicanism, of free trade across the Atlantic, is in a way a way of reinventing Dutch history at a post moment, right? After you lose the colonies, then what is then the grand narrative of Dutch history? And it becomes part of being part of a transatlantic alliance going forward, but also extending that relationship into the past and thinking about history in a new way.
I definitely agree with that. Oh, Albertina, what were you thinking?
Go ahead. Because I'm not really going to answer Kees's question. What I intended to say, so please go first.
No, I definitely agree with that, Kees, that it's partially instrumentalized. I think, but maybe Albertina would know more about this, that a narrative of gratitude was also quite consciously used to instruct a new generation in transatlantic relations during the 1960s, the so-called successor generation. So elites, I think, definitely use this narrative, not just so externally, in the sense of, how will it affect the United States audience, and will it affect the United States audience? How much attention is there for that in the United States, but also internally, so for its own population. But as Albertina illustrates with her research, I think that there is such a thing as sincere and grassroots gratitude. So I think to view it as simply instrumental is only, I would say, half the story.
Yeah, I think that's an important addition, Jorrit. That it's so there is the official expressions of emotions. I'd say are always in a way, more superficial in a sense, right? There are a bunch of people who thought about it and what to say when speeches are drafted, etc. And I think these two can overlap as well. So in my research on Ernst van der Beugel, for example, who played a key role in the Marshall Plan and in transatlantic right after the Second World War, there is a very genuine sense of gratitude. He is really very grateful for what the Americans have done. And at the same time, he is involved in the Marshall Plan, director of the Marshall Plan Bureau, and as a diplomat or a Dutch government representative, also partly responsible for Dutch expressions, like more formal expressions of gratitude. And they're one of the things that they had to take into consideration during the Marshall Plan was that Congress was going to review the Marshall Plan each year. And a big PR campaign was part of the entire deal. So to receive Marshall aid, and one part of that was demonstrating to Congress that the money was well used. But the Dutch also really felt that they had to demonstrate that they were very grateful for what they received. So also to the members of Congress, to the American people, also maybe for more strategic purposes. But both of these elements were present at the same time in a way. And Ernst van der Beugel sometimes got really frustrated with the official expressions and the hip, what was it, the hip hop hooray. Jorrit, do you remember that quote?
Yeah, that was a quote from the original documents. The hip hip hooray and thank you, Marshall.
Yeah. So these things existed at the same time. So there was this genuine sense of gratitude, but at the same time, on a more political, diplomatic level, there were all these. Well, there was more instrumentalist use maybe. And I think we should not just focus on well, either one of those, but really try to create a more holistic perspective on that and how they relate to each other as well, and really not forget that there was and there still is, I think, particularly among that World War II generation, that there is that sense of gratitude. I think opinion polls also now, if you look at transatlantic relations, demonstrate that the older generations still tend to have a more positive perspective on the US. And this was exactly what Jorrit was referring to before. So during the 1960s, a new generation came of age that had not experienced the Second World War, had not experienced the Depression, the Second World War, or the recovery projects after the war and the American role in that through the Marshall Plan, for example, but instead grew up with a very different set of formative experiences, including racial inequality and injustice, helped to inform their perspective of the United States and the Vietnam War, of course. Well, maybe as they associated the US more with political corruption after Watergate, etc. So this really created a very different perspective on the United States. And during that period, well, people like Ernst van der Beugel, just to come back to him again, try to counter those more negative images of the US with the memories of the US as a more benevolent country through, well, reminding people of that earlier period, that early post-war period, which so much inspired Ernst van der Beugel as well.
Which I could add to this story, just to to continue this intergenerational discourse, that then when people started getting angry again at the United States during the Euro missile crisis, one of the reactions of a transatlantic elite that was bound to this gratitude was, for instance, to establish the Roosevelt Study Center in Middelburg, which was established in 1982 and then in 1986, just precisely amidst those rising anti-American protests. So I can see this tension. But what I wanted to ask you, precisely because of this, was whether or not transatlantic gratitude has been characterizing also, or if you want, polarizing the domestic political debate, because I can see the diplomatic value of it, but I can also see, especially if applied to other contexts like the Italian one or other countries in Europe, that gratitude toward the United States is also can easily become a hotly political question, a divisive one, which especially the left in Italy, for instance, used to attack the center or centrist ruling elite. And of course, then my question would also be, because you've been collecting, as Jorrit said before, papers and proposals from all over Europe and also from the United States, whether or not you can see this Dutch pattern reflected, for instance, in Eastern Europe and in phenomena of expressions of gratitude after 1989, for instance.
Well, yeah, you see a lot of variation among nations, and I mean, we're not the papers that have come in are not necessarily about European gratitude for the United States. You also have just one paper that this reminds me of is Canadian Thanksgiving, Canadian gratitude for the English Royal House. So there's things like that too. Transatlantic relations, but definitely, I mean, it has played a different role in different countries. I personally think that in the Netherlands, it's relatively uncontroversial compared to Italy or France, for example. The same, I think, goes largely for Germany, although the origins in Germany, I think, were quite different. German gratitude for the United States as expressions of gratitude, I think partially were intended to show the outside world that West Germany had become a normal part of an Atlantic community, a normal country.
Well, I think of the speech that Helmut Kohl gave at the time of German reunification, which I listened to recently.
Oh.
And one of the person who Kohl thanks most explicitly and most sort of directly also is the American president, H.W. Bush. Partly, of course, because Bush was fairly late to come on board with the whole German reunification project. But he is kind of explicitly named as providing the conditions that make German reunification possible.
Yeah, so you see it also as a recurring narrative.
Which kind of brings us, once we talk about a generational issue, which brings us to the current generation, and it brings us to the last 4 years. And it may be interesting to start then by remarking that Trump, of course, has his own narratives of gratitude and ingratitude, where part of, his contributions on foreign policy very much rang along the lines of the countries that are sort of receive military assistance from the United States, that sort of live under the American security umbrella, aren't being grateful enough, and he measures, of course, gratitude in terms of monetary contributions. Which kind of raises the issue: how have you seen the theme of gratitude at all kind of reflected in either sort of the signals that are coming from the Trump White House or in the response to Trump from European leaders?
I can't see Albertina. Albertina, are you about to?
No, I was still thinking, actually. Well, I was thinking of the example you mentioned, of course, Kees, yourself already, and the burden sharing debate, and how you see there that gratitude is in a way, or ingratitude maybe, it's no one wants to be ungrateful where gratitude is to be expected, right? That's well, you don't want that. That's not a good quality. So
one way of thinking about it is the way that you've been describing the theme of gratitude is in a sense as a form of international socialization, right? It is the building up of a relationship that is rooted in history and emotion and trust and history and memory and all of these kind of other issues. And one of the striking things of the sort of the Trump approach to international relations is that sort of very little of that seems to be there, and that he comes to the scene of international politics very much from a sense of essentially having reinvented the history books that morning, sort of, and looking at these kind of relationships as if that historical context doesn't exist, isn't there.
Well, I think that when Trump says Europeans are ungrateful allies, I think the reason why that resonates is because there already was this idea of Europeans should be grateful for the things that we did for them, not just recently, but over time. So in that sense, it does, I think, tie into a larger narrative.
And it goes to what Dario mentioned at the beginning, the idea of a hierarchy, right? Someone who should be like the sense of gratitude that there is somebody who shares something, right, from the perspective of generosity, who has power, resources, and shares those with the other party, and in return asks kind of a reciprocal emotional commitment. And I suppose there is still that. Do you still get that sense that there is an expectation of that the transatlantic relationship still is there to serve fundamentally American interests and an American and that sort of this.
If you want, guys, I also want to make it more difficult, because I realize also, and I agree with Kees, that Trump has contributed not only moment of crisis in this otherwise smooth narrative on transatlantic gratitude. But I was wondering whether or not we live now in an era in which it's not been gratitude, but rather solidarity, the main thing that has kept Europe and the United States together, especially after 9/11. I remember very vividly that after the 9/11 attack, the main thing wasn't, to do something with the United States because, in a way, we owe them our liberation or our own democratic path, but because we are part of the same community, out of solidarity, the coalition of the willing, if you want, to use George Bush rhetoric. And then, in this respect, I see that the end of it, or if you want, the betrayal of it, more in Obama's pivot to Asia than in trying to absolute disrespect for the transatlantic alliance. What do you think?
Well, obviously, the world has changed, right? Even in just the last 4 years, or even in the last 6 months, the world has changed fundamentally. And so, well, obviously, a sense of gratitude is just one element in a much greater mix. And solidarity, yes, but I think for one element in solidarity is a sense of a emotional bond, not just solidarity out of we have a common enemy, but solidarity out of we have a shared history of experiences. So I definitely think that that plays a role. Even as you say, there's more elements in there. But it's not just the transatlantic relationship. It's not just about geostrategy.
I see. Albertine, do you want to add something? Otherwise, I have.
Well, I was more thinking of, more recently, of U.S. foreign policy also in transatlantic context as a bit of an aberration. Well, an aberration of the foreign policy attitude and approach that we saw right after the Second World War, that Ernst de Beugel was so impressed by, which was really focused on the long term, what he saw as an imaginative understanding of self-interest and thinking in win-win situations and building long-term relationships of trust and cooperation and the importance of allies, etc. I guess I'm mostly talking about the liberal world order in a sense, and the transatlantic the transatlantic dimension of that, and that the Trump administration is moving away from that and focusing, approaching international relations more like a zero-sum game, which I think makes it appear also, and short-term gains and deals and things like that, rather than long relationships of trust and cooperation, which also may disconnect it somewhat from this broader narrative in a sense, because it just doesn't find that it considers that to be less important, because the focus is not so much on that long term, but really on what can I gain right here and now, and motivated by this zero-sum perspective, and I think that also kind of disconnects the foreign policy somewhat from that broader history that narrative that we just focused on somewhat. Does that make sense?
Now, I don't know if this may be very much the case of the Dutch environment, which you know better than I do, but if I see it from a slightly more systemic perspective, I think that I can see the role that gratitude played in the zero-sum game that the Cold War system created, because we were part of a determinate field, of a determinate bloc. Whereas in a world which is now more complex, where relative advantages and gains are in the end possible in spite of what Trump thinks or tries to display. It comes to my mind the title of a book of a professor of mine when I was in Italy that was more or less something like Allied but Rivals, or allied but competitors. So in a world in which the European Union, as such, is more of a competitor than just a loyal ally to the United States, I was wondering whether or not gratitude then is destined to play a less important role anyhow, because there are fields in which we should gain something over the United States and acting more independently, less bound to that gratitude that made ourselves thinking that we were part of the same family in the end.
I would have a couple of things to say about that. But so I think what you described as allies and rivals, I think that up to the Trump century, yes, it was rivals, but it was still the idea that through friendly rivalry, you could increase the size of the pie. You could compete economically, and still you could all win, right? And I think that, as Albertine already described, that perspective perhaps is not as strong in the Trump administration. But this is perhaps a very personal perspective of mine. I do think that we have come at a point where we have to re-interrogate what makes a Atlantic community, and are those stories about gratitude for World War II, are those sufficient for a more diverse Atlantic world? The Dutch population is becoming more diverse. The American population is becoming more diverse. And I think that some of these old stories just won't resonate as much. But that still makes it important to bring them to the surface and to study them, and maybe to ask the question of how do we go forward.
One way, perhaps, one thing that came to mind, Jorrit, while you made this remarks, we had the current U.S. ambassador come to the Riyadh last year to give a talk on the current state of Dutch-American relations. And as you know, he had quite a few controversial media appearances on first becoming ambassador, and had since kind of figured out how to kind of respond to Dutch criticism of Trump, which he gets a lot as ambassador while appearing in public events. And his response was, look, I get it, right? You, as the Netherlands, are in American terms, fairly left-leaning liberal country. You liked Obama, you didn't like Trump. You liked Clinton, you didn't like Bush. His response to that was to refer to what he would think of as the inner architecture of the transatlantic relationship: trade, investments, intelligence and security cooperation. Which struck me but at the same time as quite a clever way to frame this, to say sort of, well, in a sense, politics doesn't matter all that much. But at the same way, as an oddly bloodless and oddly unimaginative way to frame what the transatlantic relationship is about. Because in a sense, if it is about core economic and security interests, then in a sense, European states would be within their own right to wonder whether those interests are still being served by a United States that seems to be heading headfirst into some sort of new Cold War scenario with China. And so, in a sense, that question is, do those myths still how necessary do you think those kind of shared myths and shared histories and shared ideas are? And going forward, do you see potential? Where do you see the potential of sort of injecting? I mean, do you see it as desirable to sort of inject new stories into the transatlantic relationship?
Is that a question for me, or?
It's a question for you both. It's something that I'm quite actively wondering.
Is there anything you want to say about stories, Jorrit? Because we talked a lot about narratives and how we do think it's important to reimagine or take a new perspective on the narratives we tell about the Atlantic community. What I'm thinking, well, for me, but this is also me personally, I think the Atlantic community matters because it, well, from the start was also meant to be a community of values and of and certain ideas, which I guess come back in the idea of the liberal world order, democracy, and well, free trade, and etc.
By the way, have not had a very good career under Trump.
Well, so what I wanted to say is that I actually, so personally, I think that in the current circumstances, the international, the way in which international relations are developing, I think it is actually such an Atlantic community is very important and as a value community. I do not think that, I fear that Trump has, the Trump administration has negatively affected the soft power of the United States among many Europeans and does not, I think there are a lot of internal and external factors that are challenging the Atlantic community also as a value community and just as a community in itself, so the unity in it and of it. And internally, we also in Europe and European integration, the European project was part of that Atlantic community. We see countries in Europe that are following a less liberal path. Let's put it that way. Illiberal. I mean, look at Hungary, Poland. So these ideas are challenged on the inside, and I think that the Trump administration has estranged quite a lot of Europeans from wanting to have a very close relationship with the current America. And I do think it's also very important, also for us Europeans, also those particularly who may not like the Trump administration, that the United States is more than just the Trump administration, right? Also, if we, I don't know, when we look at NATO, for example, there's a lot of worry about Trump's position on NATO. If he gets reelected, would he pull out, etc. But if you look at the American people, at public opinion, if you look at U.S. Congress, I think we see very strong support for NATO, for example. But also, if you look at climate change, something that many Europeans care very much about, and when they look at Trump administration, they they don't like the fact that the United States left, or that Trump left. Well, officially, I think that happens the day after Election Day, but the Paris Climate Agreement. But also there, the United States is not just the Trump administration. There are many states and cities that do still want to follow the Paris Climate Agreement. And I think so. I think we do need to remember and also remind people, I mean, in Europe, that the US is not just the Trump administration. And I do think.
Bertina, can I jump in for a second? Yeah. Our common friend Martin Zwiers came out with his book on profiling power just a few weeks ago, and I've contributed a chapter there which had pretty much the definition of global Atlantic in the. And my idea was that in the end, this narrative, this almost, if you want, self-reassuring story about a fixed set of principles and values that we all recognize as our transatlantic values, I'm not sure if that's really valid anymore. I mean, this is the rhetoric that we got from the ambassador, as Case was rightly saying, and almost in a way in which the ambassador was trying to convince us that if you cherish those values, of liberty, of freedom, of a free press, of free enterprise, you must be transatlantic, or you must cherish the United States. as well. Whereas I think the transatlantic space is way more open to accept also the inclusion of transatlantic sub-communities, like
Yes, exactly.
transatlantic subculture of populism and nationalism, or the transatlantic subculture of Black Lives Matter, competing nowadays for the prominence in that transatlantic space.
Yeah, exactly.
And my idea was whether or not, in the end, since emotions count in the definition of these transnational relations, as you rightly say, whether or not gratitude should still play a role in there, or we should look for something else. Again, I would like to insist with solidarity, because what I saw, for instance, with the Black Lives Matter is a manifestation of that more than a manifestation of gratitude in itself.
That's a really good point, and I was going to mention Black Lives Matter as one field where you see just that transatlantic relations are alive, right? In a larger sense, and I mean, if by gratitude you mean the story that we have been describing, World War II, Marshall Plan, etc., etc., I think that ultimately, I don't know on which time scale, it will become less and less important. Maybe in the future there will be narratives about Europeans being grateful for Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, because this was a moment when racism became something that could be discussed, which also had a larger resonance beyond the United States. So I mean, I would distinguish between the story of gratitude that we have now and gratitude just as a larger element, as a factor in just building solidarity and building effective communities, right? It doesn't have to be this story. It can also be something else.
So we are allowed to criticize the United States for betraying those same principles many times that they think are part of our shared heritage. That's good news.
We're allowed to do that, yes.
Albertina, you wanted to say something?
No, I think that Jorrit captured very well what I agree with the narrative you just shared, Jorrit. I think that's no, and also the point that you mentioned, Dario. I think that's very important to point out how all these communities are interacting on a transatlantic level, and sorry.
No, yeah, I mean, okay, we agree that the field is open and the transatlantic relation is a fluid, if you want, term, that is constantly redefining itself, and that's also the beauty of it. That's why I wanted to ask you, because you both teach in one of the few nowadays American Studies program left in the Netherlands, which is a program in transatlantic studies, right?
Well, the MA is. So there's a BA American Studies and an MA North American Studies, but focus transatlantic studies.
Transatlantic relations. Great. Now, how it is, and how do you do actually this to teach this transatlantic complexity to a new generation of students who have, well, of course, they have to study gratitude in historical terms just to understand the role that it had and it played in the definition of historically, in the historical definition of transatlantic relations and in the definition of this country as well. But how do you tackle this? How do you describe, analyze for them transatlantic relations, and what do you think your students think about transatlantic relations or transatlantic gratitude today?
I do think, so we're focusing on gratitude all the time, and I do think it's something that is one of the themes that we focus on in our research, but I do not think that we consider it to be like one of the most important elements of transatlantic relations. Like,
yeah, you're right. Scratch it. Yeah. Just transatlantic relations. Let's focus on that. How is it to teach them?
How? Sorry,
How is it to teach transatlantic relations to youngsters in the Netherlands today? I mean, I've been teaching transatlantic relations now since almost 10 years, and I can tell you the difference that I had with my students 10 years ago and the students now. Students 10 years ago perhaps were still living in the long shadow of 9/11, and again they had this sense of transatlantic community. I don't know if it's been the economic crisis that has destroyed that, or just a new generation of ideas of people that are way more interconnected. But my students today know almost nothing about what transatlantic, as even an interpretive category, mean.
Maybe that's because we have to rethink what transatlantic is. I mean, I've been teaching a couple of new courses on one that I taught last semester was African American Encounters with Europe. So that takes a long perspective of, well, you could say the Black Atlantic, but also larger than that, just African American history in a transatlantic context. And another class that I'm going to teach is going to be about connecting the local to the global. So kind of finding and building the story of transatlanticism from the ground up, from the community level up. Something that you also do, or that's an option that students could pursue. For example, the communities around military bases. Or religious communities, or things like that. So, for what it's worth, that is one of my approaches.
Yeah, I agree. I understand. I mean, it's one very smart way to trigger their interest, to make sure that transatlantic relation is not just bilateral political diplomatic relations between Europe and the United States. That the story is way more complex. That it's all about ideas, goods, people, and flows. That's the key. And I'm glad you're doing the same.
It speaks in a way to how our sort of current sense of the transatlantic has evolved, right? In a sense that it's now possible to teach Atlantic history more in a sense of oceanic history as part of a kind of shared historical space, as opposed to an associative political community, which is, I suppose, how you might have taught it 20 years ago.
And still today.
Yeah, and I wanted to say, we also include that, of course, because at least I think when we talk about the historical foundations of transatlantic relations, I think we also have to discuss that element, right? So, but we try to make it more complex than just that.
Just one question for me. Last year at the Munich Security Conference, Joe Biden gave a speech in which he had the line sort of, "Don't worry, Europe, we'll be back after 2020." Do you think? I mean, there's a lot of there's a sense of expectation around a Biden presidency. That it might sort of herald a return to the good old days, right? If that's true, what is it a return to? And do you think that it's actually going to work out like that? Is it possible to wind back the clock for 20 years to the kind of transatlantic that a Joe Biden might remember?
I don't think so. I think the world we live in today, so in a transatlantic context, is not the same world that Obama and Biden left 4 years ago, right? And I think that a Biden presidency also has to cope with that, and that you cannot just continue he cannot just continue where he left off, or Obama left off 4 years ago. I think so. Yeah, it will take a lot of.
How do you think the last 4 years have changed the dynamic of the relationship? Even if, Trump may still win a second term, we may still get 4 more years of this. But say that wasn't the case. How do you think the last 4 years have impacted the dynamics of the relationship in a lasting way?
I think that one important way is that China is not the China that it was 4 years ago. It has become more assertive. So that's a huge reality that both the United States and Europe will have to deal with. COVID-19 has only illustrated that certain developments that pandemic or climate change can only be dealt with on a global scale and not on a Atlantic scale. So just those two things mean that we can't turn the clock back 4 years. But maybe Albertina has more.
No, I was also mainly just thinking about some of the things that I expect will not change if Joe Biden becomes president. I do think that he will take a different approach and that the tone will be different and the focus, there will be greater appreciation of alliances, allies, diplomacy, and that long-term perspective and the win-win situation, free trade, etc. But, well, Jorrit just mentioned China. I think also Biden administration will expect European countries to pick a side, and also, for example, if we look at the debates about the 5G network and Huawei, etc., I don't think a Biden administration would appreciate us becoming, picking a Chinese 5G network. And the same can be said about Russia and, for example, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. I don't think the Biden administration would think that it would be a good idea for Germany and key Western European countries to become more dependent on Russia, and that will still be an issue. Same thing with the burden sharing debate, which of course goes all the way. All the way back to to the early days of the Atlantic Community. Let's put it that way. So I think the Biden administration will also put pressure on European countries to do more and to live up to their promises. But I do think that Biden administration will take a different approach, for example, towards Article 5 of NATO, and probably more clearly reaffirm U.S. commitment to that, right? For example. So I think, because I do think that there is that has to do with a difference in tone, but I think it also touches the very foundations of the relationship and uncertainty about Article 5. I think that does create that really affects the security situation in a sense, in a profound way.
I think it all boils down to going back to exert hegemony. Those good old days of transatlantic relations were the ones in which the United States exerted the role or played the role of, if you want, a benevolent, a liberal, but still an hegemony in the transatlantic.
And when the transatlantic could be defined against a communist foil, right? When the Atlantic had a mirror image, an adversary.
In some sense, that might still be true, at least in the sense that I expect a Biden administration to still focus on the authoritarian nature of China, exactly. and perhaps a community of values and democracy. But it would be bigger than Europe, right? In that sense, Europe will lose its special claim on the United States, special relationship. It will probably be more and more global.
Yeah. I tend to agree with you on a political level. I'm just a little bit more skeptical on a societal level, because I remember Obama in 2009 being greeted by thousands of students in Berlin for having done nothing, but just out of the confrontation, the comparison between Obama and Bush for Europe, that seemed to be already a big change, the promise of a post-Russia country. Whereas I think the experience, and if you want also the failures or the limitations of Obama's administration in the 8 years have provoked an impact, a change in Europe that will affect a Biden presidency from a societal level.
It kind of comes down to whether Obama was sort of celebrated in Berlin because he was American or because he shared the European and particularly German critique of the Bush administration.
Yeah, exactly. Just because he wasn't Bush. Yeah. Guys, I think this has been great. Very nice conversation. And of course, it left me with many more questions than I had before, but we're squeezing things 1 hour now, so it's enough. I'm really grateful to both of you. I'm really looking forward to reading anything that can come out of this project and to see you even more often, because I think this moment of exchange about your research ideas or your ideas about the United States are crucial for the development of our discipline. So thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you. Yeah.
Very much.
Yeah. And see you around.
See you around.
Goodbye.